Dom Alcott arrived at my shoulder at 8:15, with the expression of a man who had come to perform a rescue. The quarterly drinks had been going for 2 hours. I was still at the same corner table I had found at 6:30, with the same person I had sat down across from when Dom pointed and said, "That's her." The bar had filled up around us. The noise had climbed. I had not noticed either of those things. Dom put a hand on my shoulder and said, for the benefit of everyone in earshot, "So, how are you two surviving each other?" He said it with the particular warmth of someone delivering a punchline at someone else's expense. He was looking at June when he said it, and June looked back at him with the expression she reserved for things she had already categorized and filed under unimpressive. I said surviving is the wrong word. I turned to June. "Do you want to get out of here? Find somewhere quieter?" The table went still. Dom went still. 3 people at the adjacent table, who had been half following the conversation, went still. June looked at me for a moment. Her expression was not surprised. It was something closer to a question receiving its answer. She said yes, without hesitation, like the answer had been ready long before I asked. What Dom did not know, what none of them knew, what I had not been sent over there to discover, was what I had found out about June Harlow in the previous 2 hours. And why difficult is only an accurate description of her, if you define difficult as a person who makes things harder for people who would prefer comfortable inaccuracies to true information. My name is Caleb Harris. I'm 32 years old. I work as a project coordinator at a mid-size marketing agency called Vela, the kind of firm where the work is genuinely creative when it's functioning well and genuinely chaotic when it isn't, and the margin between those two conditions is roughly 3 missed deadlines wide. I manage the timeline, the deliverables, the client relationships, and the ongoing diplomatic situation between the creative department and the strategy department, who see the same work through different enough lenses that they occasionally need an interpreter. I have been told I am good at this. I think what I am is patient and honest, which is not the same thing as good at something, but in practice produces similar results. I live alone. An apartment with a kitchen I actually use, and more books than shelves. I work hard. I cook most weekends. I have 4 friends I genuinely like, and that is enough structure for a life. I am not, broadly speaking, a person who spends a great deal of time thinking about what is missing from it. 2 of those 4 friends work at Vela. Dom Alcott is in business development, warm, competitive, excellent with clients. The kind of person who fills a room without effort and knows it, and has decided not to feel guilty about this. Ria Yoon is in client services and has, in 3 years, been correct about nearly everything and gracious about the few times she wasn't. I trust them. That is context. Ria came to my desk 8 days before the quarterly drinks and said she had someone she wanted to set me up with. She said it carefully, the way people say things when they are managing expectations at both ends simultaneously. She said, her name is June Harlow. She's in strategy. Dom, from across the open plan floor without looking up from his screen, she's a lot. Ria said, she's interesting. She's just not everyone's idea of easy. I said, what does that mean? Ria said, it means she's very June. This clarified nothing. The drinks were at a bar 2 blocks from the office. Exposed Brick, a cocktail menu that took itself seriously. The kind of low lighting that makes everyone look like they are having a more significant conversation than they are. Vela does these quarterly, the theory being that proximity over time makes people work together better, which is true in the way most things are true when you don't look too closely. I got there at 6:30. Dom was already at the bar with Ria, both of them with the specific energy of people who have arranged something and are waiting to see what it produces. Dom pointed. June Harlow was at a corner table alone, with a glass of something and a small leather notebook open in front of her. Dark brown, worn at the corners, with an elastic closure she had looped around the back cover. She was writing in it. Not performing solitude. Not waiting with visible impatience. Actually writing. The focused quality of a person who has found something worth doing and is doing it. She was not what I had assembled from the word lot and the word difficult. I don't know exactly what I had assembled. Something sharper, maybe, or more visibly armored. She looked like a person at a table in a bar, writing something down, aware of the room around her and largely uninterested in it. I said, "You're sure about this?" Dom said, "Absolutely," in the tone that means he was absolutely something, though not necessarily sure. I walked over. She looked up before I reached the table. She had tracked me coming across the room without appearing to watch, the kind of attention that observes without making a production of it. I said, "June Harlow? I'm Caleb." "Dom and Rhea sent me over." She said, "I know." She closed the notebook around the pen, elastic back over the cover. "Sit down." I sat. The table was small and slightly sticky in the way bar tables are, and the noise of the room was a specific kind of mid-evening noise, not yet loud enough to require leaning in, just loud enough to make the corner feel separate from the rest of it. She had a glass of sparkling water, not a cocktail. The notebook was closed now, the pen tucked under the elastic. She was entirely present in the way that people are present when they have decided to be, rather than when they simply have nowhere else to be. She said, "What did they tell you about me?" I said that you're a lot. She considered this. "That's one way to put it." I said, "What would you say?" She looked at me, the direct, measuring look she had, the one that was deciding something in real time and not pretending otherwise. Then she said that I don't think most people are as interested in accuracy as they claim to be. And when you stop pretending to agree with things you know aren't true, they find it inconvenient and call it a personality problem. I said, "That sounds accurate." "It is," she said. Which is, as I said, the problem. And that exchange, in the first 4 minutes, before the drinks order had even arrived, was the moment I understood what Dom and Rhea had done, and what they had failed to see. They had not set me up with someone difficult. They had set me up with someone precise. The distinction had simply never occurred to them, because precision and difficulty look identical from the perspective of someone who would rather not be challenged. We talked for 45 minutes before I thought about Dom and Rhea at all. She worked in strategy, which at Vela meant she built the analytical framework that creative use to make decisions, audience research, market positioning. The structures that are invisible when they're sound and catastrophic when they aren't. She had been at the firm for 11 months. She liked the work and had considered feelings about the people, which she said not unkindly and entirely without apology. She was funny. Not the kind of funny that announces itself and waits for a response. The kind where she said something so exactly true that the humor was in the accuracy, and you laughed because the truth had arrived from an unexpected angle. At one point, she described a client presentation she'd sat through, where the data directly contradicted the conclusion, and she said, they read the numbers out loud, and then said the opposite of what the numbers said. With confidence. I think they genuinely didn't notice. She paused. I noticed. She paused again. They noticed. That I noticed. She asked questions that were specific rather than social. Not what do you do all day, but what do you do when the creative and strategy departments can't find the same ground? I said I translated. She said, that means you tell each side what the other side wants to hear. I said, I prefer bridge building as the description. She said, I know what you prefer. I asked what you actually do. I told her what I actually did. She opened the notebook and wrote something. I noticed this. I didn't ask about it yet. I am a person who notices things and gives them room to explain themselves before I ask about them directly. Somewhere around the 45-minute mark, I became aware of Dom and Ria. Not because they approached. Because I looked up at some point while June was in the middle of a sentence, and I caught Ria watching us from across the bar with the expression of someone observing a situation that is not going the way they anticipated. Dom was beside her. They had the look of people who had released something and were surprised by its direction. I understood then what I had not fully processed in the setup conversation. This had been an arrangement with an expected outcome. And the outcome they had expected, an hour in, still at the same table, both of us leaning slightly forward in the particular way people lean when the conversation has gone somewhere genuine, was not this. I looked back at June. She had noticed the same thing. She said, "They're waiting for me to do something catastrophic." She said it without looking toward Dom and Ria, directly at me. I said, "They've been watching for a while, I know." She picked up her glass. "Long enough to know. I have been at this firm for 11 months. Long enough that they've watched me in meetings. Long enough that they've decided what the verdict is." She set the glass down. "I don't perform things I don't feel. Most people experience that as difficulty. Did you know this was a setup?" I said. "Before tonight." She looked at me steadily. "Ria told me she was setting me up with a colleague. She said you were good at reading people." A pause. "She said it the way you say something when you are managing what someone expects to find." "Did you know it was a joke?" I said. She considered this with the seriousness of someone who had already considered it privately and was deciding how much of the answer to give. "I suspected it was an experiment," she said. "Whether I'd notice, whether I'd leave early, whether I'd say something that confirmed what they already believe about me so they'd have a story to tell on Monday." She looked at me. "Why did you actually come over?" I said, "Because I always take those things at face value until I have a reason not to." She looked at me for a moment, the way she looked at data she had not yet run a full analysis on. Then she said, "Most people who claim to have no preconceptions about me have quite specific preconceptions about me. They just don't call them that." I said, "What would you call what I have?" She said, "I don't know yet. I've only had 45 minutes." She wrote something in the notebook. I watched her write it without reading it. "You haven't behaved the way I expected," she said. I said, "What did you expect?" She said, "Someone who would spend the evening managing me." She closed the notebook. "You've been talking to me instead." I thought, this is a person who has been told she is the problem for long enough that she has had to build a very solid sense of herself just to function. And that solidity looks like walls from the outside, and people who have never needed to build anything call walls difficult. That landed somewhere in me. Quietly, after that we did not talk about Dom and Ria. We talked about strategy as a discipline, what it actually is when it's done with integrity versus when it's done to make the process look thorough without producing anything true. We talked about what it means to translate between departments, whether you lose something in the translation every time, whether a version of the truth that can be heard by both sides is still the truth or just a useful approximation. She had opinions about all of this that were specific and not adjusted for my comfort. I found it easier to talk to than the alternative. At some point the bar grew louder and we both moved, without acknowledging it, slightly closer across the table. She said something about what she writes in the notebook. Not what specifically, just that she writes down things worth keeping. Things that are actually true, she said. Or questions I don't have the answer to yet. Most days don't produce either. Some conversations do. I said, "What counts as true?" She looked at me. The thing that would still be true if the person saying it wasn't trying to impress anyone. I said, "That's a useful filter." She wrote that down. I watched her write it without reading it, and I thought, I said something. She decided it was worth keeping. That is a specific thing, and I would like to understand it better. The crowd had thickened around us without our noticing. The noise had risen another level. We were still at the same small corner table where she had been sitting alone when I walked in, and it had become, quietly and without announcement, the center of the evening. That was when Dom arrived. Dom came with the rescue expression, the hand on the shoulder, the warmth that wasn't quite for June, and said, for everyone in earshot, "So, how are you two surviving each other?" He was looking at June when he said it. It was not a mean thing by intention. It was the thing you say when you have told yourself a story about a person for long enough that the story has become the only available language for them. June looked at him with the expression she had for things she had already filed. I said, "Surviving is the wrong word." I turned to June. "Do you want to get out of here? Find somewhere quieter?" The table went still. June looked at me for a moment with the expression of a question receiving its answer. Not because the answer was what she had hoped for, something more careful than that. As if she had been watching all evening for evidence of something, and had just found it, and was deciding what to do with the finding. She said yes, not because she wanted to leave. Because she had already decided she wanted to stay, and yes was the word that kept that possible. We stood. She gathered the notebook and her jacket. I looked at Dom, who had the expression of a person whose experiment had returned an unexpected result. I said, "Thanks for the introduction." I meant it. He knew I meant it. That, I think, was the part that shocked people most. Not that I'd stayed, but that I was genuinely grateful. We walked out. The October air came at us cold and immediate after the warmth of the bar. We stood on the pavement for a moment, just outside the door, and the noise of the street. June had the notebook under her arm, and she looked at me with the direct attention she'd carried all evening. I had the quiet feeling of having made the correct decision, without yet being able to explain all the reasons why. "If you've had enough of being watched for one evening," I said, "I understand. We can call it here." She looked at me. Caleb, just my name. Like she was checking whether it was the right word for what she wanted to say next. "I came tonight because I was tired of letting other people's small cruelties organize my time. I stayed because you talked to me." She shifted the notebook under her arm. "I'm not done with the conversation. We found a restaurant 2 streets over, the kind with close tables and forgiving lighting, and no hostility toward people who stay for 2 hours. We ordered without being strategic about it. We kept talking. She told me what she had been doing before Vela, a smaller firm, better colleagues, less interesting problems. She had left because the interesting problems matter more to her than the comfortable people, which is the kind of trade most people talk about making, and she actually made. I told her about the project where I had first understood what coordination actually is, not administration, not management, but the act of making it possible for people to do their best work without friction finding them first. She wrote that down without asking if she could. I didn't mind. An hour in, she said, "You arrived at something earlier. In the bar, something shifted in your expression, and you went quiet for a moment." I looked at her. "I was thinking," I said, that you have had to build a very specific kind of solidity just to function in rooms full of people who have already decided what you are. And that the solidity reads, from outside, as walls, and that most people call walls difficult because it's more comfortable than asking what they were built to protect. She was still. I was also thinking, I said, that I would like to know what you write in the notebook. Not tonight. Not as a condition of anything, but eventually, if you ever want to show someone. Something moved across her expression, recognition of a specific kind, the kind where something you have waited a long time for arrives without fanfare. She opened the notebook. She wrote something. She turned it so it faced me. 3 words, her handwriting, small and careful. You mean it? I reached across and put my hand over hers, briefly, on top of the closed cover. She didn't move. The moment held the way moments do when both people have chosen to let them. The waiter arrived to ask if we needed anything else and clipped the edge of the bread basket with his elbow, catching it before it hit the table, apologizing 3 times in quick succession before retreating. June pressed her lips together against a laugh. Then she laughed anyway. Then I did, and the formality broke into something warmer and considerably less serious, which was, somehow, exactly the right direction for it to go. 3 weeks later, she showed me the page from the evening at the bar. The entry she had written when I asked what she had expected from the night. It read, he asked what I meant, and waited for the answer. Didn't fill the silence with something easier. I read it standing in her kitchen on a Saturday morning with coffee in hand. She was watching me read it with the attention she gave things she had already evaluated, but was checking once more. I handed the notebook back. You wrote that within the first hour, I said. Within the first 40 minutes, she said. 6 months later, she showed me the dinner page. Below you mean it, she had added something later, in different ink. Written at a different time, he did. A year after the quarterly drinks, when people asked how they met, Dom told the story of the setup with reasonable grace. Ria said she had always suspected it would go this way. June says, this is revisionist. Ria says it is not. I have learned to stay out of this specific disagreement, which is the correct diplomatic position and also the only one available to me. June still has the notebook. It is the 4th one since that bar. I have read the first one in full, over the course of a long Saturday in which she made tea and I read and she sat nearby with the current one, occasionally saying you can ask about that one or you cannot. I asked about every one she permitted. Nothing about her had changed. What changed was that now there were 2 people in the room when she was being precisely, exactly herself, and one of them found it the most interesting thing going.